Thank you. So first thing, I just want to wish everybody well. That's been heavy on my mind when I speak with people that I know that this has not been an easy time for many families. So I hope you guys are doing well. If you're not, I'm sending good thoughts your way. I am in this office in my house. My husband is a musician, so that's why I have all these keyboards. He's currently a not working musician, which is tough times for us. But I do get this like cool looking room, so that makes me feel happy. As I said, I'm a clinical social worker, and I completed my CASAC recently just to have that credential for substance use. I have been working in substance use treatment and prevention for about 14 years, first with the YMCA and now in the district attorney's office a little bit more peripherally. I feel very strongly about this presentation. I think it's a really good presentation. I think that families are often looking for really tangible ways to talk with their kids. And I think that this gives that in an easy and meaningful way. So for people who are listening, who are interested in presenting this at some point, do it. It's great. I think even when I present to two people in like a church cafeteria, I feel happy about that because I think we connect with people who really can use this information. There's a lot of tangible stuff. I think we're going to send it out to you at the end. So we'll have that, and we'll have time for questions and all of that. I always kind of put my own spin on these things. So again, for people who are looking to present it yourself, don't feel like you have to do it exactly this way. I try to fit in some stories and anecdotes of different things that I've experienced just because I find that interesting and helpful. So let's get into it. So question one is, why do you matter? Which again, it seems obvious sometimes, and maybe to people who are working, doing this work already, but it is not obvious to parents. And a lot of times parents feel like if they mention something, if they talk about this information, it's going to plant a seed in their kid's head and they're going to get all these ideas on the things that they can do and use. That is not the case. So what this showcases is that kids who learn about the danger of drugs at home are much less likely to use. So I'm going to say that again because I feel like this is really the theme throughout, that kids who learn about the danger of drugs at home are significantly less likely to use. The tricky thing there is 53% of 7th to 12th graders on Staten Island, this is a survey that TYSA conducts with Staten Island youth, said that their parents have not talked to them about the dangers of alcohol. So we have this like duality here of knowing that it's important, but then people not, or at least kids perceiving that that's not happening in a way that's meaningful for them. So we want to be able to figure out ways that we can do this better with the families on Staten Island. So starting with a thought, 9 out of 10 people with a drug or alcohol problem started using as a teen, right? So I'm just going to put that in context a little bit, that I have worked with lots of different people with substance use issues, and I can't think of a single person who ever said to me, I started when I was 25. I always hear stories about 12, 13, sometimes a little younger, and it doesn't start off as, immediate heroin use. And we're going to get into that a little bit later, but often you hear when you're working in addiction that people start dabbling with drugs as a teenager. Big but, a child who is able to get through their teen years without using drugs is highly unlikely to develop a problem as an adult. So again, I try to put this in context that the later that we can delay a young person's first use of drugs, the less likely they are to develop a problem. So when talking with teens, sometimes it's not always about don't do drugs. It might be about don't do drugs today. How, let's not do it this weekend. How can we delay this? And these facts are important because in working with people, that's an easy thing to swallow. We can think about it differently than saying to somebody, don't use drugs ever. So this slide sometimes gets a little confusing, so I'm just going to take you through it, that when kids have a high perception of risk and a high perception of disapproval, they are less likely to have to use. So meaning if a teen or a kid interprets that their parents think drugs are risky and that they don't want them to do them, they are less likely to do it. So again, might feel like an obvious thing. It's not obvious. Parents a lot of times will say, no, it's okay. I want them to be able to like drink at my house or smoke weed at my house because then at least I know they're safe. That is not a good way to respond to this. Kids can't kind of pick that apart, and for them it doesn't seem like risky because, oh, mom says it's okay, or you know, it doesn't seem like there's disapproval because mom's saying I can do this at my house. So we want parents to understand that it is okay to say it is not okay to use drugs as a statement of fact. That is okay to say, and also that it's not that there's risks associated with doing this, that what can happen, the natural consequences of using substances. Now, flip that, low perception of risk and low perception of disapproval is correlated with higher substance use. So when teens don't think that it's risky and don't think that their parents care or that their parents disapprove of that behavior, there's more likely to be use. So this is an awesome, I never know what to call this, campaign that we worked on together and put out. And we got, in looking at some of these on here, these were things that I said myself. And so that's why I thought it was such a great campaign, because it was things that even for me as somebody who's very in tune with what's happening with substances, with alcohol, it didn't connect for me that I was saying these things in front of my kid. My guys are little. I have a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old. But it doesn't matter. The earlier that I'm kind of weaving those messages into their head, the worse that feels. So thinking about saying like, work is so stressful, I need a glass of wine, or I need this drink to loosen up. Like those were ones that for me, that's something I would say. And whether it was only on Sunday when I went to my mom's or something, doesn't matter. These are things that can be interpreted as alcohol is the way I cope with my stress, right? So we want to remind our parents that the things that they say can change the perception of the kids around them, even if they're not talking to that kid. They're listening, they're hearing these things, and we want them to we want kids to understand that there's other ways to cope with these things. So I think we have a cool poll for this. We'll see if that works. In your child's mind, when is the human fully? So can we poll people, Jazz?
So it looks like, because Adrian and I are logged in as the same person, so Adrian, can you hit the poll function and try to
just hit the function? It should have popped up.
It's up. The poll is up.
Yes, I see it. Maybe I have to put it here. Can you see it?
I saw it.
Cool, guys. Oh, sorry, I scrolled to the answer.
So it says 3 more people have to respond, or maybe they don't have to, because let me know when you want me to end the poll.
You can end it because I accidentally put the answer up.
Okay.
But that was cool. That was our first poll. So we had 3 people say 25, which is the right answer, and 2 people saying 18. So yes, the answer is between 24 and 25 is when our brain is done growing. So that is always a wild fact. And again, for people who aren't aware, when you're looking at a 16-year-old, you know, your 16-year-old son who's taller than you, who knows how to, you know, do all kinds of things with computers, or is learning how to drive, it really feels like that's an adult. That's a person who's making all of these different decisions. But in the end, their brain is not done growing. So I think the part for me that's most concerning is the last thing that develops in our brain is good judgment. So the fact that we're not even able to make good decisions, that part of our brain, not that we're not, but that part of our brain hasn't finished growing, and we're put in these scenarios where we have to do that, is really tricky. And so a lot of times, even in like marijuana conversations, this comes into play, because all of this thought has nothing to do with my opinion on drugs being bad or even my perceptions on marijuana. It's not about that. It's the idea that having any substance in a brain that's still growing stops it from reaching its potential. So what we're trying to convey is how can we set this person up for the best outcomes. Okay, so something else that we want to bring into this conversation is the things that are happening in a child world. So this was, I'm just going to close the poll. This brings together a lot of different things that kids are dealing with. And I think for me, that was always a struggle that I had in my life, where I would say something to my very traditional Italian family, and I would say how much it was stressing me out. And they would say like, oh, Amanda, you have the world by the tail. What do you mean? Or, you know, comments that just sort of minimize the things that I was feeling. So I really try, and now I'm 36 and I feel like I can see how that happens now. And when I talk to kids, I really try to stay focused on what that must be like for them, because I know that there's a million fish in the sea and, you know, all the other things that we learn as we get older. But for that kid, it really does feel like the whole world is falling apart. So they have all of these different areas that we've identified: problems with friendships, problems with relationships. The availability of drugs and alcohol now is a huge piece that, you know, didn't necessarily exist in the same way when I was younger. Dealing with social media is another piece. So thinking about this, we want to be able to talk with teens about all of the different stressors that exist for them. And it might not be all of these things, but it might be some of these things. So over here, right, nearly 1 in 5 Staten Island youth reports using drugs and alcohol before their last sexual encounter. So again, this is in our community. This isn't data from elsewhere. That's what kids are reporting. And so we want to just be cognizant of all of these big decisions that kids are making and how we can support them in getting through that. So special vulnerabilities. Now, I like to think about this as red flags. It doesn't paint the whole picture, but they're pieces that we should pay attention to when a child is specifically managing one of these situations. So a family history of drugs and alcohol is absolutely both a genetic and an environmental potentially struggle that someone can be going through. So if we have a kid who has a family history of substance use disorder, there is a higher likelihood that they will use substances as a result. Close friends who use drugs or alcohol, another one, we want to pay attention to that. If we're aware that a child or teen is hanging out with someone where that's going on, we should not have our blinders up to that. That should be something we're paying attention to. Early first substance and alcohol use, as we said, when we have young people that are struggling to delay that first use, that's a red flag there that something is happening. Problems in school and learning disabilities, which could be ranging from bullying and struggles with friends up to diagnosable conditions that some people are struggling with. Youth who identify as LGBTQ+, that population, we want to just keep that in mind, that when a youth is identifying that way or is struggling with identifying, we want to pay attention there to see if they need support in the substance use area as well. Exposure to trauma and depression and other mental health issues, all of these. And again, they're red flags. Just because we're speaking with someone and they're telling us about their family history doesn't paint the rest of the story, but it's something that we want to attend to. So we know that all of this feels like really scary stuff. And when you think about all of those vulnerabilities, I can think of so many kids that are already in that position, but there are things that can protect against that. And that's exactly why we're here. We want to be able to talk about the different things that we can do to mitigate these risk factors that kids are born into. So, is there a poll for this one too? Cool. So we have another poll. What do you think are the top substances used in our Staten Island community?
Is it up for you guys?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry. I don't know why this Adrian and I co-presenting. I can't see.
Okay, so we have pills, alcohol, marijuana. People are identifying. Can you guys see the finals? No, let me see if I do this. Learning. Can you see it now? Or still no? Okay. So we have pills identified, alcohol identified, and marijuana identified. So yes, these are correct and some. So we're going to move into taking a look at some Staten Island specific data. Okay. Whoops. So this is some data from, again, from a survey that we conduct with Staten Island 7th to 12th graders. So to put that in context, we're talking about 12 to 17-year-olds. And if you take a look here, alcohol is being identified in a huge way as something that young people are regularly engaging in. So this survey was asking, in the past 30 days, have you used alcohol? So we're seeing here between so this is 2008 data up to 2018 data, and it's between 24 and 20, almost 29% through those years. So that's it's a scary thought, because we're talking about lots of young people where this behavior is happening. And again, it's not to say that alcohol is inherently a bad thing. It's to say that we're hurting our potential, the potential of young people, when we're seeing this kind of involvement with substances. So binge drinking is something that I like to dig in a little bit. For women, it's considered a binge if a person has between 4 and 5 drinks in a sitting, and for a male, it's 5 to 6 drinks in a sitting. And so often I like to think about what is a drink, because when I'm talking to young people, a lot of times they think that when you're holding a red Solo cup and somebody pours vodka in it in the middle of the park, that red Solo cup is one drink. And so I like to take that back for them, that one drink of hard liquor is an ounce and a half. One drink of wine is 4 ounces, which is about a half glass. And one drink of beer is 12 ounces. So if we're just dumping vodka into a red Solo cup, it's possible that you have 6 or 7 or 8 drinks in that one cup, depending, what the person's doing. So our liver can only process 1 drink per hour. So if there's 6 drinks in this cup, then I am not going to be sober again or below a 0, like thinking about blood alcohol levels, for 6 hours. And so when we're thinking about 17-year-olds who are starting to drive, this is something that they have to be educated on, because they think there's a lot of perceptions about, like, well, have you seen the bagels at that deli? They're huge. Okay, that will not make you sober. Showers, coffee, the liver is still doing the same process. And so it's important for young people to start to understand that, because it's a huge concern. And this is, percentages of teens who are doing that. We see marijuana here trailing alcohol a little bit, and then some use of prescription pain relievers and stimulants, tranquilizers, and then even a tiny percentage of heroin, which again, for 12 to 17-year-olds, any number to me is a scary number of people that are engaging in these behaviors. So how did we get here, right? Thinking about why do we have 12 to 17-year-olds that are thinking about using heroin? So I like to take it back. When I was in high school, I went to Curtis. I graduated in 2002. And at that time, there were no pills in the school. It was not there. And I hung out with some shady individuals at the time, but it was just not something that people were doing. We heard about cigarettes, we heard about beer and wine, liquor and marijuana, a smaller group was using. And then we occasionally heard about shrooms or ecstasy, even acid. I almost never heard about cocaine, and heroin and so on. So, and right from there, my brother started Curtis 4 years after me. And after I graduated, and when he got there, there were tons of pills. so there was this happened in the early 2000s with the availability of prescription medication. The scarier thing is this, that it plugged a hole in what we're calling the drug ladder that wasn't there before. So the folks who were, you know, using cigarettes and beer, some of them moved on to, in this progression, to using hard liquor, to using marijuana. And then a very small amount moved on to the much, quote unquote, harder drugs. The availability of prescription medications just plugged that hole. And so when teens are using, or anybody is using prescription pills, whether it's pain relievers or benzodiazepines, which treat anxiety, or stimulants, they seem very safe initially when this first began. Maybe they saw mom taking it, maybe they saw friends taking it before, and nothing bad happened, right? So it was, I put that in quotes, in fake quotes. So because of that, again, we're talking perception, that the perception of risk is lowered. I see people doing this, I see nothing bad happening. There was this idea we're safe. And when people first begin using substances, they often will take the pills orally at first, just swallowing them the way that you would when you have a prescription. And then some people progress to crushing them and inhaling them. And a lot of people stop there. That is also how people intake heroin. So it's not that big of a jump to think that a person would move from inhaling the powder of a crushed pill to an of heroin, especially when it has a similar effect on the body. So parents often have a lot of questions about that. Like, how did this happen? He's such a good kid. I would hear that all the time. And I would say to parents, like, to me, it has nothing to do with good, not good. Like, you're associating these feelings with using heroin, but really for a lot of young people, it's just to stop themselves from feeling sick. Are dependent on opioids specifically. If you take them every day for a period of time and then try to stop taking them, you go into withdrawal, right? All withdrawal is feels like what it's been described to me as a flu times a million. So like your skin crawls, sweats, vomiting, lots of boogers, nausea. It's just an awful overall feeling. And if you can stop that feeling by just taking that drug one more time, that's how a lot of people function in their addiction, is I'm just going to do this one more time today. I'll fix it tomorrow. I'll deal with it tomorrow. And it's the same thing moving to heroin. If you don't have access to that prescription opioid, then it's very easy to say, well, this heroin is going to fix this. Yes, I'll take a little bit. And so that's how the progression in this ladder has so deeply affected our community. So I'm just briefly going to give some examples of prescription medications. The first one there is Vicodin, which is a painkiller, pain reliever, analgesic. And so this falls into a class with OxyContin, oxycodone, Percocet. There's lots of different variations of opioid pain relievers, and essentially are heroin, just in a pill form. They do the same things. Stimulants like Adderall and Ritalin are used to treat ADHD. But when taken, when you don't have ADHD, they produce this effect of like, they calling speed, able to stay up for long periods of time. And then benzodiazepines, also called benzos. This is a class of drugs that includes Xanax, Valium, Ativan, Klonopin, medications that treat anxiety. And they also are an extremely risky medication because if you're taking them daily and you stop taking them, you can suffer a seizure. So it's very risky to try to deal with benzodiazepines without a medical professional. We have a resource guide, a drug guide that has more information on all of these medications that you will have access to as well. So coming back to alcohol, alcohol for our purposes is a drug, something that alters our mood, alters how we feel. We would often say in treatment groups that a drug is a drug is a drug. Somebody would say, oh, I just had a drink. No, that counts. Let's talk about it because it changes, it changes the way that we feel. Very dangerous to combine alcohol with prescription medication. So that was something that we were also seeing commonly and can result in a drug overdose, which we're going to speak about a little bit more later on. vaping, we're reading a lot about now. So you see here, we have a whole a picture of different types of vape pens and cigars that people are using. The first little square guy there, the Juul is the one that we're seeing a lot, even calling this juuling, we're hearing. And it's a very risky business, again, because we're inhaling liquid chemicals into our lungs, and it's not supposed to be in there. So we're seeing, they're calling it popcorn lung. A lot of teens experiencing anxiety and feeling like they can't breathe, resulting in having to go to the ER. So I think because they're odorless, they don't trigger smoke detectors. It's something that parents have to really be paying attention to, because you can't tell the difference between if it's nicotine or marijuana. A lot of times there's no difference in smell, or they both smell very fruity because of whatever kind of liquid is involved. Marijuana, which we spoke about a little bit, it is possible to become dependent on marijuana. A lot of people feel like that's not a thing. What we have to keep in mind is it's not the marijuana of the 60s and 70s. The potency has increased over the decades, the potency of the THC, which is the active ingredient in marijuana, partially because of hydroponic that people are growing the plant. And because of that, it can change the way that it impacts with our young people. So when marijuana is actually classified as a hallucinogenic drug, and so people, depending on different strains of marijuana, people are having different reactions to them. And we're even seeing research now that marijuana can be triggering for psychosis, particularly among young Black and brown men. We're seeing that trend, that high rates of marijuana use can have an effect on that. So something to pay attention to. I think too, I wanted to mention, just when I frame these things, because marijuana is always a tricky conversation, particularly with the legalization in different areas and medicinal marijuana. It's a difficult conversation to have, and I don't want to minimize that, but I want to give you an example of a young woman that I worked with. She participated in the Little program when she was young. She graduated when she was like 12 or 13, and she was in Little Steps at the YMCA because she had a family history of substance use disorder. Her mom had a heroin history and her dad had a cocaine history, and so she was there to kind of learn about how to prevent this in her own life, which I feel strongly about. That when kids are learning about their medical history, you know, we talk to our kids about dad's diabetes or mom's heart issue. Those are things that are openly spoken about in the home. History of substance use disorder should be the same way. It's protective for kids to know that, because they make better decisions when they're armed with the information. So this young woman in particular, she had this family history. She learned a lot about what that meant for her own development. She was 17. She returned to the YMCA, and I met with her again because she started smoking weed. And what she said to me is she knew she didn't want to turn out like her parents and develop this more serious use of heroin or cocaine. And so we started setting goals. And what we said was, what the goals that she wanted to set was, she didn't drive high and she didn't want to be high in front of her mom. And I thought that those were really good, you know, good goals for a person to have. So again, I don't go into those sessions and say, don't smoke weed. I say, like, what are we trying to do here? What are you trying to get out of it? And so she set those goals. When she came back the next week, she wasn't able to stick to it. And what that said to her was, wow, this really was more serious for me than I thought. And we took some more urgent steps to try to deal with it. But I think putting it in those terms for people and saying, like, okay, you feel like this isn't it, that you're not dependent on it, that you don't need it. So let's try to not do it for a day and see how you feel. Those can be very different conversations with young people, because they don't want to be out of control of their decisions. That's important to them. So new methods of taking in marijuana, having concentrations of THC, marijuana oils or wax, and that's inhaled usually as a vapor. And then K2 is a synthetic cannabinoid, which was being marketed kind of as potpourri in delis, and people were buying it and smoking it. Had very different side effects than marijuana. So I'm still hearing about it a little bit, but not as frequently as I had been hearing about it a couple of years ago. And heroin, which again is an opioid. There's an image here of a needle and the candle, because when heroin, it comes as a powder, so you have to break it down into liquid form in order to be able to inject it. And so that's why often you have to have a kit in order to be able to do this, which includes a heat source. It includes a spoon, tin foil, something that you can use to heat it up. And then you have to pull it into the needle before you inject. Part of what's going on right now with overdoses in our community is because the heroin that's here contains fentanyl. So fentanyl is an analog. It's not derived from plants. It's completely like made in a lab, and it's extremely powerful. So heroin people can overdose on by itself. Fentanyl makes it a million times worse. We're having people are just not able to recoup when using fentanyl. So what we're seeing is even a very small amount, when a person takes that in, particularly by injection, it reduces your central nervous system. So when a person has an overdose, it's really not as dramatic of a situation as some people imagine. Typically, you intake the substance, and then what a lot of people call a nod, you start to see the person do this kind of move where they look like they're falling asleep, but then they kind of still maintain a conversation sometimes. After the nod comes the overdose. So we never know if that's going to happen or not. So as you're watching people, that's the point that we want to start paying attention to what's happening with their breathing. If a person starts making a gurgling sound, if their face or their lips or their nail beds start to turn blue, and basically the person, their respiration becomes so that they're just not taking in any more breaths. It comes so slow. So when an overdose happens, a lot of times for the person who's overdosing, it feels just like any other time that they use that opioid. So they have a period of time that they don't recall, and then they usually come back to the situation. When you overdose, the difference for the person is they wake up and everybody's really upset, or ambulance, or I'm sick because the Narcan put me into withdrawal. And so it's a tricky conversation to have with a person, because a lot of times they wake up angry because for them, it didn't feel any different. We're going to talk about Narcan a little bit in a moment. So what do we do about all of this? We have all of this information. The first step that we think about is just to learn the facts, which is what we're doing right now. So learn about what's happening in our communities with drugs and alcohol, be able to convey that to parents so that they can digest it and talk about it in a way that's meaningful, and realize that it's not the same world that we grew up in. So a lot of parents will say, like, well, I smoked weed. It's just a phase. That I hear parents say that a lot. The thing about the times that we're in right now is we don't know who it's going to be a phase for and who it's going to affect the rest of their life. And that's the same framework that I talk about it with teenagers, that I don't know. I could be presented with 10 people, and like 7 of them might be totally fine, but maybe they grow up, they meet somebody, that person says, I don't want you to do this anymore, and they stop. That happens, right? Or some people have a baby and that just changes their perspective and they're able to stop. But there's the smaller group of people who are not able to do that. And because we don't know who, it makes it very dangerous for everybody to be in that position. So how do we communicate this? We want to be as clear as possible about the risks, because remember, those risks, communicating risk to young people is the piece that the research is saying we need to get across. The second piece is the disapproval. So we want to make sure that young people understand this is a dangerous thing and it is not okay with me. Parents worry sometimes that if they say that it's not okay to use drugs, that the kid's going to sneak around, do it behind my back, all of these different fears. It's not the case. Kids will still come to you. That part is about the relationship that a person has with the young person. So you have to make sure that you're also feeding the relationship. Talk to your kid, listen to what's going on in their life, not just about these specific issues. when you have that, then even if the kid knows that they're going to disappoint you, they're still going to tell you about it because you're a safe person. And that's what this is about. How do we set this up so that they know how I feel, but they also know that I'm a safe person? We want kids to have refusal skills. So how do they get out of this situation? If they're faced with this, how can they back out? A lot of parents will make a really personal plan with the kid, that you call me up and say, I forgot to get what you asked me to pick up. And that's the message, that the parent says to the parent, I have to come and get them. It could be a text thing where you text a certain word and that then the parent calls you and says, you're in trouble, you have to come home right now, or whatever it is. We can be creative with those things to help parents set up ways for the kid to get out of the situation with. Because remember, a lot of kids, just because they don't want to do drugs doesn't mean that they don't want to be cool. Like, they're still trying to figure out how to navigate that with their friends, which is really tricky. So to bring us back to the talk, it matters because the kids have a high perception of disapproval and a high perception of risk likely to use substances. So as you can see here, when we have perception of disapproval, the younger the kid is, the higher their perception of disapproval. So that makes sense, right? As we get older, kids maybe have experiences, see things that lets them know, whatever they thought at first changes. So we want to pay attention to that and make sure that we're conveying that message no matter the age. And similarly, perceptions of parental response and consequences resulting from alcohol use. So when kids are younger, these are 7th and 8th graders, they are perceiving that major consequences, right? We see it here, major consequences to using alcohol, and that they're perceiving that from their parent. But as they get older, this drops. So it's something to pay attention to our kids, no matter how old they are. Some tips to do this. We want to know who our kid is with, know what they're doing. Be that parent who shows up at the party and says, oh, just checking, just seeing what's happening. It is okay to do those types of things. Know where your kid is. So we used to always say, my mom would ask us so many questions before we left the house, and we used to harass her about it. But I get it now. I get it, that those are important things, not only because she's checking what I'm doing, but she's also keeping me on my toes, because if I don't have answers to those things, then I'm not going to be allowed to go. It's important. She's communicating to me her disapproval of situations or approval of other situations. Know when your child is expected home, and then make sure that they're home at that time, and know who they're with. Be that house, be the hangout house, right? Where the teens can come, have a space, so that you can be a part of it, maybe not for the whole time, but some of the time. Know how money's being spent. A lot of times that's a sneaky way that kids will say, I need $5. Sometimes that's enough for the size of their habit at that time. Establish the rules in the house. It's okay to have a do not use drugs policy. It's okay to make it a contract that your kid signs. You can be creative about how we put these things out there. And then how do we spot this? Teens are tricky, right? Because they are ever changing kind of creatures, and they're in a real transitional period in their life. But what you want to pay attention for is change in behaviors. So because a lot of this is a typical teen behavior and might have nothing to do with drug use. It might just be how that teen is at the time. That's why, again, it's red flags, same as the vulnerabilities that we discussed earlier, that we want to pay attention, but it's not necessarily the whole picture. So if we see declining school grades in a kid who was doing better, or a kid who's now sleeping during the day or sleeping through activities enjoy, changes in friendships, changes in hygiene, we want to pay attention to all of those things, because it could be an indication that something is happening, something's changed. It's important too that addiction does not discriminate. So again, I mentioned families, I hear it so often. It really breaks my heart that moms will say, he's such a good kid, she's such a good kid, I don't know how this happened. And that hurts me, because this is some of the things that we can do to try it has nothing to do with being a good kid. It has to do with refusal skills, with understanding what's going on in the drugs in our current Staten Island. It has nothing to do with money or how we grew up or any of that. And it had, you know, so don't let that cloud your vision when you're speaking with parents, because it just doesn't matter. It can happen to anybody. And then what do we do? So now maybe we've noticed this sign. We see that something has happened. What do we do next? Parents have to give themselves a little pep talk. You can do this. Focus, make sure it's a good time. You even can say to the kid, like, is this a good time? I want to have a little bit of a serious conversation. That's you checking in with them too, that, you know, making sure that they understand that that there's not good times for things like that to happen. Then communicate your disapproval. This was not okay with me. Remember, disapproval is different from anger. You can be disapproving of something and not be angry about it, or you can convey it in a way that doesn't come off as anger. Set up the rules. Let the teen or young person participate in the rules and the consequences. That if, let's write them down. And then once you do that and you agree on what the rules are going to be, you have to monitor. So you're looking for evidence. You're looking to see that the person is following along. And that can range from, you know, I had a parent who just kept a calendar, and in the calendar, he would write the different behaviors of his daughter, because he felt that there were certain things that he saw when he knew that she had begun using substance again. So it could be simple, or it could be that you're drug testing the person. It just depends on what families are comfortable with. And if this is something that you can do, that's okay. We have tons of professionals on Staten Island that want to be able to support families in this. TYSA is a great resource, because they can make sure that you're connected to the agencies that can help. So we're going to put up some resources here, and then we also have a resource guide that contains a lot of this information for the providers on Staten Island that can assist. So in schools, there are SAPIS counselors, guidance counselors. Some schools have a health center. Those are a great resource, and a lot of that is still going on. Even during this time, we still have those functions in place. And then there's community resources. There's agencies that are doing prevention work. There's prevention, meaning a person doesn't have a diagnosable substance use disorder yet, and they're working with them to try to prevent that from happening. And then there's treatment programs where there is a diagnosed substance use or family member of, and you're just working to help that time. And these are some websites of national resources and some local stuff. And the last piece is prescription take back. So on Staten Island, the DA's office is 4 locations where we have drug drop-off. So you can go into these 4 pharmacies at the top and just give back drugs, no questions asked, and then do that at the police precinct. So it's a safe way for people to get the drugs out of their house. And then naloxone. So we spoke a little bit about overdose. Naloxone is the overdose reversal drug. So it looks just like that image. It looks like Flonase. And basically when you're suspicious that a person is having a drug overdose, you put it in their nose and spritz it up there. If they are not having an overdose and they're having a heart attack or some other kind of medical issue, the Narcan will not hurt them. So it's okay to use it even if you're not sure that that's what's happening. And there's some agencies listed there that the majority of which are still giving out naloxone Narcan right now. These are some other resources available. I'll leave that up there. And I think we can open it up for questions and how TYSA can be a resource for you.
Yeah, so thank you, Amanda. You're so wonderful. And now I know we're coming up on time, but if anyone has any questions, we want to just spend a couple minutes going through any specific questions that you have, any resources that you'd be interested in learning more about, things like that. So anyone have any questions? And I'm going to turn the record off now, so you're not going to be questioned and record.